Hello, and welcome, fellow night owls. You found your way into a darker corner of history tonight. And I'm so glad you're here. Maybe you're winding down after a long day. Maybe the hum of a fan is spinning nearby, casting gentle shadows across the room. Or maybe the world outside your window is already asleep, and you're drifting, looking for something quiet to fall into. Wherever you are, however you're listening, I invite you to settle in. Dim the lights. Let the silence of the past wrap around you like a cloak. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Is it midnight where you are, or dawn just breaking? Tonight, we're not just telling history, we're whispering it, drawing it out of forgotten corners and into the stillness with you. These aren't just dates and names, these are lives. And some of the most extraordinary lives of the medieval world belong to women who were never supposed to have power, never meant to lead, to speak, to rule. But they did. And our first story begins not with a crown, but with dust. The girl who would one day become an empress was born not in a palace, but in a crowded district of Constantinople, sometime around the year 500 AD. She was not born to privilege. Her father worked as a bear keeper in the hippodrome, the great arena where chariots clashed, and the people roared like waves crashing against the marble seats. Her mother, an actress, barely scraped together enough to feed her children after her husband's death. They were part of the city's underclass, performers, dancers, beggars, survivors. And the girl, her name was Theodora. She grew up backstage, behind the bright flare of torches and the fading shimmer of grease paint. Her world smelled of sweat and all lamps and trampled straw. She learned early how to move, how to smile, how to survive. As a young girl, she took to the stage like so many others, not for fame, but for food. But even then, she was different. They said she was clever, too clever, that her eyes seemed to pierce through the painted masks and velvet curtains, that she listened more than she spoke, and remembered everything. Her beauty turned heads, yes, but it was her wit, her sharp humor, her refusal to be silent, that made people stop and listen. When she was still a teenager, Theodora left the city. She traveled far, to North Africa, perhaps even Alexandria. She became a companion to a high official. Some called her a courtesan, others a concubine. She called herself neither. What matters is that she learned it. She observed how men in power moved, how they commanded with silence, how politics was a theater grander than any stage she'd known. And when she returned to Constantinople, everything had changed. There, in the heart of the empire, a man named Justinian was not born into royalty either, but he was ambitious, meticulous, brilliant. The empire was his obsession. Law, reform, order. He believed he could rebuild Rome itself, in spirit if not in stone. And when he met Theodora, something unexpected happened. He listened not to her past, her ideas, her fury at the way the world crushed women like her under its heel. And something in her voice must have struck him, not pity, but clarity. Against the wishes of the aristocracy, against the venom of the Senate and the whispers of the court, Justinian married her. And when he ascended the throne in 527 AD, Theodora, the bear keeper's daughter, became Empress of Byzantium. Her enemies called her vulgar, a harlot in silks, a stain on the empire. But she held her head high, wore her crown with steady hands, and walked the marble halls of the great palace like she'd been born there. The empire would soon learn. Theodora was no ornament. She sat beside Justinian during state councils, advised him in private, and spoke with the authority of a sovereign. She was not content to be silent, not when she had seen what the world did to the powerless. And then came the fire. In 532 AD, Constantinople burned with rage. The Nika riots, a massive uprising sparked by factional tension and resentment toward imperial corruption, erupted like a storm. The mob surged through the streets, setting palaces ablaze, toppling statues, slaughtering officials. The city was a living pyre. Justinian panicked. He prepared to flee, but Theodora, calm, dressed in imperial purple, eyes like still water, refused. She stood before the panicked men of the court, her voice level, her gaze unflinching, and said, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. She would rather die an empress," she told them, "than live in exile." She urged her husband to stand firm, to reclaim the city, to crush the uprising before it devoured the empire. Her words turned the tide. Justinian sent in his generals. The riots were quelled in blood. The city rebuilt. And Theodora. She had proven herself unbreakable, but her power wasn't only forged in fire. It moved in quieter ways too. She pushed for laws that protected women, laws that gave wives greater rights in divorce, that punished men who trafficked young girls, that allowed actresses and former prostitutes to leave their pasts behind without shame. She built the Metanoia convent, a place of refuge, not punishment. A place where women could begin again. She had not forgotten where she came from. And she would not let the empire forget either. In the mosaics of Ravenna, Theodora is preserved in glittering stone, jeweled, regal, solemn. But behind that solemn gaze was a woman who had lived 100 lives in one. A girl who had clawed her way from the dirt, who had walked through fire and shadows, who had reshaped the world with a whisper. She died in 548 AD, possibly from cancer. Justinian was never the same. They buried her in a tomb fit for an empress. But her spirit had already become something larger. A presence, a legend. The bearkeeper's daughter, the actress, the voice in the flames, the woman who would not be silenced, and somewhere, in the hush of twilight, you might still hear her if you listen. In the fading echo of Theodora's name, we now drift westward, across seas turned black under moonlight, through the crumbling shadow of what was once Rome, past ruined villas overtaken by moss, through forests that whispered in forgotten tongues, into the heart of a land that was breaking and becoming. The world was not safe, not for anyone, least of all for women. But in the bitter wines of early medieval France, there rose a queen not of conquest, but of blood, of lineage, of survival. Clotilde. You may not have heard her name. History rarely carved hers into stone, yet without her, France itself might not have become what it is. She was born around 474 AD, a time when the Western Roman Empire had collapsed into silence, leaving only fragments. Tribes warred, kingdoms flickered and died like candles in the wind. Into this chaos, Clotilde came crying into the world, a Burgundian princess, daughter of King Chilperic II, and from the very beginning, death followed her. Her father was murdered by his own brother. Her mother cast aside, her siblings gathered. She was a child, watching blood soak through royal carpets, hearing the clang of iron boots in the halls of her childhood. Whatever innocence she carried was buried with her kin, and yet, she lived. No one expected much of her. In the old courts of Burgundy, orphan daughters were political leftovers. But Clotilde was patient, quiet, waiting. And then, the offer came. Clovis, a pagan Frankish king, young, powerful, dangerous. He ruled the northern lands of Gaul, his warriors loyal to the gods of war and thunder, their axes sharp with conquest. But Clovis, for all his strength, knew the value of marriage. A Christian wife could bring him alliances, legitimacy, even spiritual favor. If such things were real to him, then Clotilde accepted. She left behind what remained of her family, the halls that still reeked of betrayal, and traveled north to the domain of the Franks. The court she entered was brutal. Clovis ruled with the sword. Trials were settled in blood. Feasts ended in violence. The gods of the old world, Wotan, Donar, Teve, were still whispered in the dark by warriors who didn't trust the cross. But Clotilde brought her faith with her. She prayed alone. She raised her children in the Christian tradition. And she whispered, slowly, carefully, to her husband, about mercy, about heaven, about power that came not from iron and flame, but from light. Clovis scoffed, but then something happened. Their first child fell ill and died after being baptized. Clovis raged. He blamed her God. He cursed her prayers. But she did not stop. Their second child lived. She continued to speak to him, even as he rode out to war, even as his men slaughtered rivals across the countryside. She reminded him that empires could be built on more than fear. And then, on a battlefield near Tolbiac, as Clovis faced annihilation at the hands of the Alemanni, he made a promise. In desperation, surrounded, his men falling around him, he cried out not to the gods of his fathers, but to hers. If you grant me victory, I will believe in you. The battle turned. Clovis returned not just a king, but a man transformed. In 496 AD, beneath the vaulted ceiling of a church in Reims, he was baptized. Alongside him, thousands of his warriors. It wasn't just conversion. It was foundation, the beginning of a new Christian kingdom. one that would shape the very heart of Europe. And behind that moment, behind the crown, the incense, the holy oil, stood Clotilde. She had done what no general could, no priest, no advisor. She had turned a kingdom, quietly, persistently, with the faith of a woman who had lost everything, and still believed, but the world does not reward such women gently. After Clovis died in 511, the realm fractured. Their sons, four in total, turned on each other. Kingdoms were divided. Borders shifted with every betrayal. Clotilde, now a dowager queen, was forced to watch as her own blood spilled their brother's blood, generation after generation. In grief, she withdrew to Tours, the city of Saint Martin, and gave herself over to prayer. Not out of weakness, but out of heartbreak. She had built a kingdom, only to watch it tear itself apart from within. They say she spent her final years caring for the poor, washing the feet of pilgrims, lighting candles for sons who would never reconcile. She died around 545 AD alone, but not forgotten. The Frankish kingdom endured. It became Francia, and eventually France. And in its roots, tangled in war, faith, and fire, is the story of a woman who never held a sword, but changed the fate of a nation. Clotilde, the queen in the shadows, the mother of kings, the whisper behind the baptism that shook the world. We pass by her tomb and the wind stirs, as if some part of her still walks the earth, watching, praying, hoping her sons might one day make peace. But the Middle Ages had only begun, and in the centuries ahead, there would be more women like her, some with crowns, some with pens, some with nothing at all. But all of them unforgettable. And tonight, we keep listening. The candles flicker lower now. Maybe the room around you has grown quieter, maybe your eyes are growing heavy, or maybe you're just leaning deeper into the stillness. Let it hold you. Let the world outside drift a little further away. We followed Theodora from the gutter to the throne, and Clotilde threw blood and faith into the bones of a kingdom. But the Middle Ages were far from finished with their queens, because there were still women waiting in the shadows of cathedrals and the silence of cold stone keeps, women who were born to be bartered, but chose to rewrite the terms. And now we turn our gaze to the wild shores of early medieval England, to a woman caught between kingdoms. A woman who stood at the fault lines of faith and war, love and loss. Her name was Thelfold, the Lady of the Mercians. She was born sometime in the late 860s, during the fiercest storm of Viking invasion. England was not yet England. It was a fractured land, a patchwork of warring kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria. And in the shadows of these kingdoms, the Norsemen came like thunder. Their ships sliced through rivers, their swords carved cities from the map. And the Saxon kingdoms, already brittle, began to fall. But one stood firm, Wessex, and at its helm was Alfred, king, warrior, scholar, strategist, and father. Thelfold was his daughter. From the very beginning, her life was shaped by war. Not in stories, but in flame, monasteries burning on the horizon, fields black with ash, villages turned to graves. She was raised not with lullabies, but with military maps and the psalms of exiled priests. Yet her childhood was not all iron. There was love in it too. Alfred was stern, but not cruel. He taught her not just how to speak Latin and read scripture, but how to think like a ruler. He saw in her not a fragile princess, but something harder, sharper. At some point in her early teens, she was married off, as all royal daughters were, to secure an alliance. Her husband was Thellard, Lord of Mercia, a nobleman, a warrior, older, but not unkind. And so Thelfold crossed into a new realm, Mercia, a kingdom wounded, hollowed out by Viking raids, its old strength fading. But she did not go quietly. Unlike many noble women, she was not content to sit behind veils and walls. She joined her husband in the governance of the realm. She learned how to read the pulse of a broken kingdom, how to rebuild alliances, how to command loyalty in a time when even priests carried swords. Together, they held Mercia, barely, against waves of Norse incursions, against the cold eye of the Danelaw, the vast swath of England controlled by Viking warlords. And then Thellard fell ill. The sources are vague, but something began to fail in him, his body, his mind. And so, slowly, without ceremony, Thelfold stepped not forward. As a regent, she took not control. As a placeholder, but as ruler, the Lady of the Mercians, not queen. That was a title reserved for kings' wives, not their daughters. But Lady became something greater. It was not ceremonial. It was earned, and she earned it every day. She led armies. She built fortresses, burhs, defensive strongholds against Norse attack, ringed with timber and stone. She outmaneuvered warlords and turned once hostile tribes into allies. The chronicles speak of her victories not with surprise, but with reverence. In 917, she led Mercian forces in a brutal campaign that saw the recapture of Derby, one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw. It was bloody. And it was personal. Derby was sacred ground to the Danes. And in retaking it, Thelfold not only broke a piece of their hold on England, she broke their confidence. One by one, other towns followed. In a world ruled by male warriors, she stood at the head of her armies, her commands obeyed not because of her birthright, but because she had proven herself, again and again, to be the sharpest blade in the room. Even the Welsh and the Scots acknowledged her authority, even the Norse feared her, and one of her family, her brother, Edward, son of Alfred, was king of Wessex by now. The siblings worked in tandem, not always without tension, but with a shared goal, the unity of the English. But it was Thelfold who inspired fierce devotion in the Midlands. She knew those lands, had bled on them, had rebuilt them with her own hand. She was not a conqueror, she was a protector, and perhaps that's why, when she died in 918, Mercia mourned as if a queen had fallen. Her daughter briefly succeeded her, a rare thing in the 10th century, but was quickly displaced by the political tide. The chronicles grow quiet after that, but her legend does not dot in the towns she saved, in the fortresses she built, in the very dream of a united England she endures. She never wore a crown, but she wore command like armor. And in a world that devoured queens, Thelfold stood, alone, unbowed, and unforgettable. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the silence gather, you might picture her, not in a gown, but in chainmail, her hair braided back, eyes fixed on the horizon where the fires burn. Can you hear it? The wine rising through the trees. The hush of something old stirring in the distance. The kind of silence that doesn't just quiet the room, it thickens it. Like mist in a forest just before dawn. History lives there, in that stillness. And tonight, we return once more to another woman, another world. Her name was whispered in monasteries and carved into the minds of kings, but she held no sword. Her weapon was light, ink, prayer, knowledge, and her presence rippled through the medieval world like candlelight across a stone floor. She was Hildegard of Bing and Germany, the Rhineland, the 12th century. This was an age of crusades and cathedrals, of knights and cloisters, of popes and emperors locked in battles as bitter as any waged on open fields. And while blood ran through the streets of Jerusalem and flames swallowed heretics in France, far away in a small Benedictine monastery nestled in the wooded hills near the Rhine, a girl was having visions. She was the 10th child of a noble family, and so, by custom, given over to the church. It was not a gentle offering. At the age of 8, Hildegard was placed into the care of an anchorite, Jetta of Sponheim, the woman who had walled herself off from the world, body and soul. Hildegard's childhood unfolded in a tiny stone cell, cut off from the sun, the seasons, the pulse of human life. Silence was her companion, prayer, her language. And yet, within that silence, something bloomed. Visions. She saw shapes of fire, towers of light. A voice, not loud, but unmistakable, speaking of creation, of the cosmos, of the soul and its terrible brightness. She didn't understand them. She didn't speak of them, not yet. When Jutta died, Hildegard was chosen to succeed her. She led the growing community of nuns, not as a reclusive mystic, but as a teacher, a guide. And still, the visions came, rising behind her eyes like storms behind the hills. She became ill under their weight, feverish, paralyzed, until she made a decision that would change everything. She wrote them down. What followed was Sivia's Know the Ways, a vast, stunned the church of theological. The visions were rich with symbolisms, cosmic wheels, radiant souls, the breath of God unfolding creation like a scroll. But more than that, they were coherent, structured, beautiful. And they came from a woman. The church, cautious, suspicious, tested her. But eventually, the Pope gave his blessing. Word spread. The recluse from the Rhineland became something else entirely. A prophet. An abbess, a voice. She began to write in every direction. Medicine, botany, philosophy, ethics. cosmology, music. Her mind was a cathedral, and within it echoed ideas centuries ahead of their time. She wrote about the healing properties of plants, about the connection between mind and body, about the feminine aspect of the divine, Sophia, holy wisdom, not as a metaphor, but as a presence. She called it viriditas, greenness, the sacred force of life pulsing through everything, from leaves to lungs to the stars. And her music, oh, her music, not stiff chants, but soaring, luminous compositions, hymns that moved like wine through stained glass. She believed music brought the soul closer to the divine, that it opened doors words alone could not. She composed Symphonia Harmony Celestium Revelationum, the symphony of the harmony of heavenly revelations, music that lifted the roof of the human mind. People listened. Kings sought her counsel, bishops begged for her advice. Even the Emperor Barbarossa, at the height of his reign, received her rebuke when he strayed too far from justice. She was bold, sharp, unapologetic. She wrote letters by the hundreds across Europe, to monks and noblewomen, to abbots and prisoners. She spoke of corruption in the church, of the need for reform, of the danger of forgetting the soul in the pursuit of power. And through it all, she remained in her monastery, the earth beneath her feet, the river whispering nearby, the stars overhead, and the visions always returning. Hildegard died in 1179, in her 80s, an age rare and hard-earned. They say when she passed, two streams of light crossed the sky above her abbey. Signed a benediction. Centuries would pass before the world caught up to her, before doctors began to rediscover what she had hinted at, before theologians dared speak of the divine feminine, before composers heard again the scale of the stars in their dreams. But she knew. There is something haunting in her words, not because they are ancient, but because they feel too alive. In one letter she writes, "The soul is symphonic, not singular, not flat, but layered, melodic, tension and harmony, yearning and grace, all within the body of one human being." She believed creation was a song, and she knew in her bones that light and shadow lived together, that the divine was not only above, but within. And tonight, if you close your eyes, if you listen past the noise of the modern world, you might hear it, a single note, carried on the breath of wind, the voice of a woman who saw God, and wrote down what she saw. Hildegard. The soul symphonic, the whisper behind the veil. Maybe you've let the world outside dissolve completely now. The walls of your room, the ticking of the clock, the day's wait, all of it drifting out beyond the reach of your senses. All that's left is this voice, and the hush of a past that refuses to be forgotten. You've met queens in armor and prophets in veils, women who reigned from thrones and from cloisters. But not all power wears a crown. Not all influence rides into battle. Some of the most profound voices in history were written in ink, not spoken aloud. Hidden between lines, waiting centuries to be heard. Tonight, that voice belongs to a woman cloaked not in silk or iron, but parchment. She was born around the year 1098, in the heart of a literary age that rarely made space for women, yet her mind carved space for itself. She was a writer, a scholar, a lover, and the author of some of the most intimate, explosive letters the medieval world would ever know. Her name was Heloise, and her story begins not in battle or coronation, but in a classroom. Paris. Early 12th century. The city was swelling with knowledge, cathedrals rising, universities forming, monks arguing theology like soldiers on a battlefield. And at the center of it all stood Peter Abelard, a philosopher, a logician, a man whose intellect burned too brightly to be ignored. He was brilliant, proud, reckless, and he met his match in her. Heloise was young, perhaps just a teenager, but already famed for her intelligence. Raised in a convent, educated beyond most men of her time, she spoke Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She was sharp, eloquent, uncompromising. Abelard, seeking a place to stay in Paris, arranged to board in her household. Her uncle, Fulbert, agreed on one condition, that Abelard tutor his niece. The arrangement was perfect, and it was disastrous. Their letters would later describe it, not as romance, but as fire. Intellect met desire, and the two became inseparable. They debated theology by day, whispered poetry by candlelight. Their love unfolded not in secret, but in defiance. She was not seduced. She chose him. But in medieval Paris, a woman choosing her own fate was an act of war. Soon, she was pregnant. They named the child Astrolabe, after the instrument that maps the stars. They married, in secret, to appease her family. But Heloise never wanted it. Marriage, she believed, would chain her, dim the brilliance of what they had. Love, to her, was sacred only when it was free. She would rather be his mistress than his wife. His equal in mind and spirit. Her words would later echo this truth. I preferred love to wedlock, freedom to a chain. But the world had other ideas. Fulbert, her uncle, furious at what he saw as betrayal, plotted revenge. One night, men broke into Abelard's chamber and mutilated him. A brutal act meant not just to punish, but to silence. He lived, but the fire between them. Changed. In shame, Abelard took holy orders, became a monk, and Heloise, perhaps in grief, perhaps in protest, entered the convent of Argentea. She took the veil not as surrender, but as a shield. A place to bury her broken self, even as her mind continued to blaze. For years, there was silence between them, until letters began to pass between cloister and cloister. Their correspondence would become legend. Centuries later, readers would discover them and be struck not just by their beauty, but their pain. These were not the pious murmurings of medieval saints. These were raw, aching, brilliant voices to souls trying to make sense of the ruin between them. Heloise's letters pierce across the centuries. She writes not as a noon, but as a woman torn open. I am not pretending, Abelard. You know I am not. I would rather be your whore than another man's wife. And yet, she stayed in the convent, not out of fear, but conviction. She rose to become abbess of the Paraclete, the small religious house Abelard had founded and given to her. Under her leadership, it became a place of learning, of dignity, of quiet rebellion. She cared for her nuns like a mother, like a general. She taught them to think, to question, to survive. In their letters, Abelard turns more toward God, toward guilt. But Heloise never stops burning. She never pretends that the past can be erased. She insists on remembering, on naming the pain, the love, the injustice. And maybe that's why her words still feel so modern, so alive. Because she refused to lie, even in Latin, even in ink. She lived until about 1163, long after Abelard had died. They were buried together, first apart, then side by side. And centuries later, when Romanticism swept through Europe, their remains were moved to Paris, to Père Lachaise Cemetery, a garden of the dead, where stone angels lean over moss-covered tombs. Even now, people leave notes there. Letters, roses, secrets, because in a world that still struggles to listen to women, Heloise's voice survives. Not just as a footnote in a man's story, but as a mind that refused to be erased. She was never a queen, never a saint. She held no power but her words. And yet, those words echo deeper than many kings' names. So tonight, as your thoughts soften and wander, imagine her, hunched over a table in a cold stone room, a candle flickering, quill in hand, and a fire behind her eyes that has never gone out. heloise.scholar.lover.abbs.unbowed.unforgott and. The hours slip by now, like grains of sand through a loosened hand. You might feel it, that subtle shift in the air, when time loses its edges. When the world becomes soft around you, the quiet hum of night, the low breath of your own body, the sense that something ancient is unfolding, just beneath the silence. We've walked with empresses and queens, with warriors and mystics. But now we enter the world of a woman who lived not in the blaze of power, but in its shadow. She did not hold a throne. She did not write prophecy, and yet, her choices changed the course of an empire. Her name was Isabella of France, and history would remember her as the She-Wolf of France. The title meant to shame her. But tonight, we step closer, we listen without fear, and we ask, what did she endure, and what did she become? She was born in 1295, a princess of France, daughter of King Philip IV, whose rule was cold, ruthless, efficient. She was raised in the glittering halls of the Capetian court, surrounded by wealth and ceremony, but also calculation. The politics of Europe were etched into her bones before she could even speak them aloud. And at just 12 years old, she was married to the King of England, Edward II. It was a political alliance, a royal sealing of blood and territory. She crossed the sea to her new kingdom, a child sent into a lion's den. But she arrived with poise described by chroniclers as beautiful, articulate, regal beyond her years. England, however, was a land in turmoil. Her husband, Edward, was already deeply attached to another, Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose influence at court eclipsed even that of the Queen. Gaveston was no mere friend. Their bond was intense, personal, and deeply resented by the nobility. Isabella found herself not a wife, but a stranger in her own court, disregarded, humiliated, her dowry lands given away, her dignity worn thin. The lords despised Gaveston, and the country itself grew restless under Edward's rule. Eventually, the nobles forced the king to exile his favorite, and later, had him executed. But peace did not return. Because Edward found another, Hugh Despenser, a man crueler, more ambitious, more destructive than Gaveston ever was. He ruled England beside Edward like a shadow king. He took land, tortured enemies, destroyed noble families. And Isabella, she was pushed aside once again, stripped of income. Her children taken, her reputation dragged, but Isabella watched and waited. She began to speak with the discontented, the barons who had lost everything under Despenser's wrath, the nobles who saw Edward's weakness as England's ruin. Quietly, carefully, she formed bonds. In 1325, Edward sent her to France to negotiate with her brother, the new French king. And she did, but she did not return. She had tasted freedom, and she did not intend to give it back. In France, she met Roger Mortimer, an English exile, once imprisoned by Edward, now escaped and burning with vengeance. Together, they formed an alliance that would reshape history. And yes, a romance. It shocked the courts of Europe. A queen consorting with a fugitive, but Isabella no longer cared. She was done with silence, with obedience, with waiting. In 1326, she returned to England, not as a wife, but as an invader. With a small mercenary army, she landed on the Suffolk coast. And as she marched inland, the people rose to her side. The nobles joined her. The cities opened their gates. Edward and Despenser fled, were captured. Despenser was executed, brutally, publicly. Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the young Edward III, and Isabella became Queen Regent, ruler in all but name. For a time, England bent to her will. She governed alongside Mortimer, wielding power with confidence and purpose. There structured the royal finances, negotiated peace with Scotland, held the fragile realm together in the wake of civil collapse. But power is a dangerous strength. Mortimer grew arrogant, dismissive. He adopted the very arrogance of the men he once hated. And Isabella's son, Edward III, grew older. In 1330, just 4 years after his mother's triumph, the young king staged a coup. Mortimer was arrested, tried, hanged. Isabella was spared. She was not executed, but she was removed, exiled from court, sent to live in comfortable seclusion at Castle Rising. There, she faded from the stage of history. Not quite disgraced, not quite revered. A presence, a question. A woman remembered more for how she took power than how she used it. But what was the truth? Was she a traitor, a seductress, a liberator, or was she all of these, and more? A girl bartered into marriage, a queen ignored and betrayed, a woman who had nothing left to lose, and so dared to take everything. She died in 1358, after decades in quiet retirement. They say she asked to be buried with Edward's heart, a final gesture, symbolic or sincere. No one can be sure. Her tomb lies in the Franciscan Church of Newgate, long lost now, but the whisper of her legend remains. Isabella of France, the she-wolf, the queen who turned against her king, and lived. So as you drift deeper now into sleep, or into thought, imagine her, standing on the deck of a ship as England's cliffs rise before her, wine catching the hem of her cloak. Steel in her eyes, not a monster, not a martyr, just a woman who had been silent too long, and chose finally. The night is quiet now. Even the air feels older. Heavier. As if the past itself were pressing gently against the walls. Maybe the shadows in your room have softened into something safe. Maybe your breathing has slowed to match the rhythm of another century. Or maybe you're just still enough now to hear what history rarely says aloud. That power sometimes wears no crown. Sometimes it writes no letters. Sometimes it lives in the small, deliberate resistance of a life refused to be erased. Tonight, we follow a woman whose strength lived not in thrones or invasions, but in silence, in memory. In the way her name still burns gently through time. She was born a slave, and she died a saint. Her name was Bathold. We return now to the 7th century, to Frankish Gaul, that strange, flickering world built atop the ashes of Rome. The Merovingian kings ruled in long-haired splendor, their courts dripping with gold and politics and ghosts. And somewhere, perhaps in Anglo-Saxon England, perhaps even further east, a little girl was born, Bathold. Her name meant battle, though she wouldn't wield a sword. We don't know her parents. We don't know the place of her birth, but we know what happened next. She was taken by raiders, or slavers, or simply by the cruel machinery of her time. She was brought across the sea, a body for sale, like countless others, passed into the hands of Retold, mayor of the palace in Neustria. A man of status, of cold ambition, he bought her, and for a while, Bathold disappeared into servitude, a ghost among the silks and stone of the palace. She served in silence, moved like a shadow through a gilded cage. But there was something in her, something that made even those in power pause. They said she was beautiful, not in the way poets praise, but in something quieter. Her bearing, her stillness, her intelligence. Retold noticed. He wanted her for his wife, but Bathold refused. Imagine that. A slave refusing a nobleman. And somehow, surviving, she vanished from his court, hid herself among the servants. Until, perhaps by chance, perhaps by fate, she caught the eye of another, Clovis II, king of the Merovingian prince, young and politically isolated. His court was torn by rival factions, his advisors hungry for influence. In Bathold, he saw not just beauty, but something rare. Composure. Wisdom. A quiet fire. They married, and a slave became queen. But this is not a fairy tale. Bathold did not retreat into luxury. She did not forget where she came from. In fact, her reign, first beside Clovis, and then alone as regent for her sons, was defined by a fierce, unrelenting care for those left behind. She remembered the chains. And so she broke them. She outlawed the sale of Christian slaves across the kingdom. She worked to free children from servitude. She granted lands to monasteries where the poor could find refuge. She used her power to dismantle the very system that once devoured her, and the nobles hated her for it. They whispered, schemed, feared the former slave with the heart of a sovereign. But she endured. When Clovis died, she ruled as regent for their son, Clotaire III. In the years that followed, she navigated the blood-sworn politics of the Frankish court, standing toe-to-toe with bishops, generals, and the hungry jaws of the aristocracy. But she was not interested in glory. Eventually, she stepped down, walked away from the throne she had earned, and entered the Abbey of Chelles, a place she herself had helped restore. There, at last, she found something close to peace. Not silence, not withdrawal, but devotion. To God, to service, to the quiet revolution of choosing humility over ambition. She died around the year 680, and the people, the ones history usually forgets, remembered her, the freed, the poor, the mothers and children whose lives had been spared the fate she once knew. They called her a saint. Not for her miracles, but for her mercy, for being the queen who remembered. You won't find Bathold carved into cathedral walls. No shining crown sits in a museum bearing her name, but her legacy runs deeper than stone. It lives in every law that defied the chains, in every act of quiet resistance carried forward by those with no sword, no voice, no power, except their will. So as you drift now, into sleep, or something near it, picture her, a woman with calloused hands, once bought and sold. Now kneeling in candlelight. Eyes closed, a queen in simple robes, praying not for power, the dark is but softer for justice. Now. Maybe there's nothing left in your room but stillness, just the low hum of breath, the trace of candlelight behind your eyelids. History moves slowly here, not like the noisy clocks and flashing headlines of our world, but like water under ice. Silent. Relentless. Deep. And in that silence, we return to the past, not to a battlefield, not to a cathedral, but to a girl, sitting at a desk. The year is 1306 for the 100 Years' War rages between England and France. The Black Death has already swept through Europe, leaving behind hollow towns and shivering faith. And into this wounded world, this world that has buried so many daughters in silence, is born a girl who will write herself into history. Her name is Christine de Pizan. Her father was an astrologer and physician in the court of Charles V of France, a learned man, a man who believed in reason, in books, in stars. He made sure his daughter was educated, even though such things were considered excessive for girls. Christine learned to read, to write, to think. Her childhood was filled with scrolls and stargazers, poetry and planetary charts. She absorbed it all, not as a curiosity, but as a hunger. She was intelligent, observant, quiet, but not meek. She married at 15 to Etienne du Castel, a court secretary. Their marriage, by all accounts, was gentle, loving. He supported her intellect, encouraged her to keep learning. But life does not often leave happiness untouched. When she was just 25, Etienne died, taken by plague or fever. No one knows for sure. Her father had already passed, and just like that, Christine was left alone. Widowed. With 3 children. In a world that had no room for widowed women. No patience. No mercy. And she did something unthinkable. She picked up her pen. She wrote, not just for beauty, but for survival. She wrote poems, ballads, laments. She wrote to earn money, to keep her household alive. She wrote with grief in her chest and fire in her throat. And people listened. In a world where almost every public word was spoken by a man, Christine became Europe's first professional female writer. Not a patron, not a noble woman playing with verses, but a working author supporting her family line by line, book by book. Her writing was precise, emotional, controlled. She spoke of widowhood, of injustice, of the delicate ache of memory. And gradually, she began to write not just about herself, because the world but about women. The world of scholars and poets and priests was built on a lie. That women were lesser, that they were sinful by nature, that they were incapable of reason, of virtue, of greatness. She read their words. Jean de Moon, whose Roman de la Rose painted women as deceitful and base. Aristotle, who called women incomplete men. Even some church fathers, who spoke of Eve as a door through which death entered the world. Christine de Pizan read their words, and she picked up her pen. She wrote the Book of the City of Ladies, a masterwork, both allegory and argument. In its pages, Christine imagines 3 personified virtues, reason, rectitude, and justice, who guide her in building a great city. Not of stone, but of memory, a city built entirely of women. Saints, queens, poets, warriors, scientists, and philosophers, women who had been erased. Dismissed. Forgotten. She built them back into the world. One by one, she laid their stories like bricks, their names like towers. Sappho. Judith. Sibylla. Marguerite. The women of legend and scripture and reality, lifted into a space where they could be seen and defended. Christine did not rage. She reasoned. And her reason was as sharp as any sword. She argued that women were as capable of moral and intellectual greatness as men, not because they had to prove their humanity, but because it was already there, hidden beneath centuries of lies. She wrote letters to queens, treated princes and scholars as her equals, dared to question the very foundation of the intellectual world. And the world didn't burn her for it. In fact, they listened. She became a fixture in courtly debates, respected, sometimes reviled, but always heard. Even when war returned, even when madness consumed the king, even when her own country buckled under the weight of history, she kept writing. In the final years of her life, when she had retired to a convent, when France was dying under English siege, she wrote one last book, a poem. It was about a girl, a 17-year-old soldier in battered armor. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, a peasant who claimed to hear saints, who led French armies into battle, who defied every expectation, every rule, every limitation placed on women. And Christine wrote in awe. Her final words were for Joan, not just as a warrior, but as proof. Proof that women were never less, only buried, and now rising. Christine de Pizan died in 1430, the same year Joan was burned alive. But her words lived on. The first woman in Europe to live by her pen. To defend her sex not in protest, but in poetry. To build a city in her mind, where no woman was ever unwanted. And tonight, as your breath slows, and the dark folds around you like a page turned gently closed, you might feel her presence. At a desk, quill in hand, candle flickering, eyes steady. And behind her, 1,000 silent women, slowly stepping into the light. Christine de Pizan, the scribe who refused to vanish, the builder of the invisible city, the writer, the night has its own memory, its own way of holding things, not with clarity, but with feeling. A name, a face, a distant shape moving through fog. That's how history lives in the dark. It doesn't shout. It murmurs. And maybe now, in this soft place where dreams start to blur with waking thought, you can feel it too, the weight of a life brushing gently against the edge of yours. We return once more to a world of silence and storm. And this time, we travel east, to the russet hills and cold rivers of 10th century Kiev. To a woman whose fury became legend, whose vengeance shook an empire, whose faith would sanctify her name. Her story is not gentle. Her name was Olga of Kiev. Before Russia, before Ukraine, before the great Orthodox cathedrals stood draped in gold, there was the Kievan Rus, a loose confederation of Slavic tribes and Norse settlers, bound together by trade, blood, and fear. Olga was born into that world somewhere between 890 and 9 to 5. No one quite agrees on when, but they agree on what she became. She married Igor of Kiev, a prince descended from the Viking Rurikid line. Together, they ruled a growing power, one foot in the wild woods of the north, the other in the glittering courts of Byzantium. Their rule was built on tribute, extracted from smaller tribes who lived at the edges of the Dnieper River. And one of those tribes, the Drevlians, grew restless. They resented Igor's demands, resented Kiev's power. And one day, they murdered him, not in battle, not in war, but during a routine mission to collect tribute. They ambushed him, tied him to two bent trees. Let them go, and tore his body apart. And then, in an act of breathtaking arrogance, they sent envoys to Olga. To propose marriage. The Drevlian prince believed she would need a husband now, that she was weak, that she was prey. They didn't know her. Olga welcomed the envoys. She honored them. She offered them rest, a bath, a chance to clean themselves before appearing in court. And when they entered the bathhouse, she locked the doors and burned them alive. Then she sent a message to the Drevlians. She accepted the proposal, she said. But first, let her receive the most distinguished men of their tribe to escort her to the prince with honor. And when the second delegation arrived, she buried them alive. Still, it wasn't enough. She marched to the Drevlian capital, Iskorostan, and demanded tribute. Bushels of grain. Livestock. 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household, she said, as a sign of peace. The people, grateful, handed them over, but Olga had men tie sulfur-soaked cloth to the birds' legs. That night, she released them, and they flew home to their nests beneath rooftops, inside barns, under the eaves of every house, and the city burned, not in conquest, but in fire set by wings. Those who survived were slaughtered, or enslaved. Or ruled by her hand. She crushed the Drevlians not out of rage, a political mind with no margin for mercy. A ruler who understood that a woman could never afford to appear wounded. She did not remarry. She did not abdicate. She ruled alone as regent for her son, Sviatoslav, and her rule was brilliant. She reformed the tribute system, established administrative centers across her lands, built the foundations of a centralized state that would last centuries. And then, she turned towards something even deeper. Faith. Olga traveled to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, where domes rose like heaven's stones and priests sang in Greek beneath candlelit vaults. She studied Christianity quietly, carefully, and there, she was baptized. It was not just spiritual. It was strategic. She took the name Helena, after the mother of Constantine, and she returned to Kiev not only as a queen, but as a Christian queen, one of the first in a land still ruled by pagan rites and old gods. Her son rejected the new faith. She did not force him, but she waited. And when her grandson Vladimir finally converted, bringing all of Kiev and Rus into Christianity, it was her seeds he planted. Olga died in 969, but by then, she had already become myth. A woman who began as a young widow, who ruled through terror and brilliance, who embraced a new faith, not out of meekness, but mastery. The church canonized her a century later, Saint Olga, the first Russian saint of the Orthodox tradition. They call her equal to the apostles, but names. They never tell the whole story, because behind the title is a woman who survived the unthinkable, who bent vengeance into strategy. And sorrow into sovereignty. She did not whisper. She did not plead. She became fire. And history remembered the warmth and the burn. So tonight, as sleep curls around you, imagine her not in a cathedral, Not in legend but standing on the banks of the Dnieper, a crown in one hand, a torch in the other, looking into the dark, and not blinking. Because she has already been there. Olga of Kiev. The darkness is thick now, like velvet pulled across the sky. No sharp edges, no noise. Just and hush, and the slow turning of the world beneath your thoughts. If you listen carefully, you might even hear its soft footsteps of a life from long ago, walking quietly across the floor of history. A queen, a mother, a prisoner. Tonight, we follow a woman who lived between revolutions and ruin, whose name became a whisper of both extravagance and tragedy. Her world was golden, then it was red. Her name was Marie Antoinette. She was born in 1755 in Vienna. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, Archduchess of Austria, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, ruler of the sprawling Habsburg Empire. She was not raised for power. She was raised to marry it. And at just 14 years old, she was sent across the mountains and rivers of Europe, into the glittering jaws of Versailles, to become the Dauphine of France. To marry the awkward, uncertain Louis August. To become, in time, Queen. Imagine her, a girl in pearls and powdered hair, riding in a gilded carriage, her name stitched into treaties, her fate wrapped in lace. But Versailles was not kind. She was a foreigner, a Habsburg in a Bourbon court, a child in a palace of masks, where smiles were sharp and silence was deadly. Everything she did was watched, judged, measured in rumors. She did not produce an air right away. Whispers grew louder. She wore silks and diamonds. She laughed too brightly, danced too late, spent too much. They called her Madame Deficit, a symbol, they said, of all that was wrong with France. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. The country was bleeding long before she arrived. The people starved under a system broken from the roots. The monarchy was a dying machine, creaking under the weight of centuries of excess and inequality. She was a cog, a glittering piece in a collapsing world. And yet, she did not flee. When the Bastille fell in 1789, and the revolution began to roar, she remained beside the king. As mobs marched on Versailles, as the court was dismantled brick by brick, she held her children close and stood firm. They took the family to Paris. To the Tuileries Palace, a cage dressed as a home. They were watched, mocked, guarded day and night. Marie Antoinette, once the queen of fashion, now sewed quietly in candlelight, her jewels stripped away, her eyes growing older. The royal family was arrested, failed, brought back in chains. Louis was tried. Convicted. Executed. And then it was her turn. Her son was taken from her. Her daughter kept in another cell. She was moved to the conciergerie, a stone prison damp with despair. They cut her hair, stripped her name, and put her on trial. The charges were grotesque, many of them invented. She was called a traitor, a monster, a drain on the nation. She stood and said almost nothing, because what could she say to a world already screaming? On October 16, 1793, she was led to the guillotine. Her hands were bound, her face pale but composed. As she climbed the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I did not do it on purpose." Those were her last words. The blade fell. She was 37, the girl who had once worn peacock feathers in her hair, who had laughed in mirrored halls, who had bathed in milk and slept beneath painted ceilings. Gone. But not forgotten. History turned her into a symbol of decadence, of downfall, a cartoon, a warning, a punchline. But she was a woman, a mother, a queen made by politics, destroyed by a revolution, and remembered, not always fairly, not always clearly, but remembered, nonetheless. The legend says she once told the starving people, "Let them eat cake." But there's no record of those words, only silence, and a question. What happens to a girl raised in a palace? When the world decides she should burn, so tonight, let the image drift gently through you, not of the queen in diamonds, but of the prisoner at dawn. Pale, tired, human, Marie Antoinette, neither villain nor saint. Just a thread in the tapestry of a world unraveling. And maybe now, as you breathe a little deeper, as the dark folds in around you like a velvet curtain, you can feel her story soften in your hands, not as judgment, not as glory. Just as a life. Flickering. And fading. The night like a candle almost out, quiet, as if listening. The stories we carry through the dark aren't always grand. They don't always come wrapped in gold or carried on trumpets. Some arrive in chains, some in letters never sent, some in silence so deep, it hums. And now, we walk beside a woman whose name is rarely spoken outside the pages of dusty books, yet whose courage rewrote a dynasty. She was neither born royal nor crowned, but her will shaped an empire. Her name was Nurjahn. Light of the world. The Mughal Empire, early 17th century. A realm of marble palaces and burning deserts, of jeweled thrones and thunderous wars. It stretched across much of South Asia, ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan and Timur, emperors who wielded unimaginable wealth and even greater power. And in that world, where women were kept behind silken veils, hidden in the zenana, the private chambers of the harem, one woman rose to become the real ruler of an empire. Nurjahn was born as Marinissa in 1577 to Persian immigrants who had fled hardship and found opportunity in India. Her father rose quickly in the Mughal court, a man of skill and loyalty, and she? From the beginning, she burned brighter than anyone expected. She was beautiful, yes, but also learned. She could read and write Persian, compose poetry, design architecture, and shoot a bow with deadly precision. But even brilliance must wait its turn. At 17, she was married to a soldier, a nobleman of modest rank. They had a daughter. And then? Her husband died, some say in battle, others whisper darker things. She entered the emperor's harem as a widow, which, in Mughal society, often meant the end of a woman's story, but not hers. In 1611, she caught the eye of Jahangir, the emperor himself, a man ruled by passion, by addiction, and by pain. They married, and history tilted. At first, she was simply one among many queens, but Nurjahn, light of the world, did not remain in the shadows. She didn't just advise Jahangir, she guided him. She issued royal decrees in her own name. Her face appeared on imperial coins, an honor almost never granted to women. She held court, received ambassadors, signed legislation. She rode elephants into battle, personally leading troops to rescue the emperor when he was captured. This wasn't influence behind a curtain. This was power visible, undeniable, and entirely her own. And never yet, usurping, she always illustrating. She knew how to soften a blow with beauty, how to turn policy into poetry. She built gardens, commissioned architecture, and filled the court with artists and scholars. Under her influence, Persian culture blossomed. The court became a place of subtlety, of brilliance, of deliberate grace. But power invites enemies, and time makes no promises. As Jahangir's health declined, succession became a bloody game. Nurjahn backed her son-in-law, Shahriyar, the man married to her daughter. But others rose stronger. When Jahangir died in 1627, the empire fractured. His son, Shah Jahan, the future builder of the Taj Mahal, seized the throne, and Nurjahn fell. She was not killed, but stripped of her influence. Her wealth. Her voice. She lived the rest of her life in quiet seclusion in Lahore, with her daughter by her side. She spent her days in poetry, reflection, the slow erosion of memory. She died in 1645, buried in a modest tomb, her own design, next to the man she had once ruled beside. No crown. No army. Just a single line etched into stone, in Persian. Without the light of your eyes, the world is dark for me. That's all. But maybe that's enough. Because Nurjahn did not need to shout. She moved through history like ink through parchment, soft, permanent, unstoppable. A queen not by birth, but by brilliance. A ruler not by sword, but by mind. And in a world that sought to hide her, she governed. Tonight, as you drift, as shadows stretch like silk across your thoughts, imagine her, a woman dressed in rose silk, standing beneath a moonlit arch, ink staining her fingers, a dagger at her side. And a nation beneath her breath. Nurjahn. Empress. Architect. Shadow and sovereign. The night is deep now. Behind the veil, just full of stories half remembered, faces half seen, and the breath of centuries pressing gently at your window. We followed queens, saints, warriors, scribes, but tonight, we follow a woman who never asked for power, yet became the soul of a dying world. She ruled with nothing but sorrow in her hands, and still, she endured. Her name was Zheng Yi Sao. Madame Zheng, the most powerful pirate in history. Not fiction. Not myth. But real. The South China Sea, the early 1800s, a time of empires and hunger, of broken dynasties and shifting tides. Western powers were carving pieces of China into trade routes and colonies. The Qing dynasty was cracking from within. And in the waters beneath it all, lawless and wild. A fleet was rising. At its head, a woman who began with nothing. She was born in 1775, possibly in Guangdong province, possibly sold into prostitution as a child. Records blur. As they often do when women live outside permission, she worked aboard a floating brothel in Canton, the shadow city of smoke and silk on water, until 1801, when the infamous pirate Zheng Yi chose her not just for her beauty, but for her mind. He married her. But what followed wasn't submission. It was alliance. Together, they united the most powerful pirate confederation the South China Sea had ever seen, the Red Flag Fleet. Hundreds of ships. Tens of thousands of men, floating cities of rebels, criminals, and desperate souls. And at the heart of it, a woman with iron in her gaze. When Zheng Yi died suddenly in 1807, perhaps in a storm, perhaps by sabotage, everyone expected the empire to shatter. At did in single quotes t. She took command. Zheng Yi Sao, the widow, summoned the pirate captains to her side. Some refused. She crushed them. Others hesitated. She outmaneuvered them. And many bowed. She restructured the fleet, created her own laws, instituted taxes, codes of conduct, rules for battle, rules for surrender. She created one of the most disciplined pirate organizations in history. Under her command, the Red Flag Fleet attacked Qing government ships, raided colonial ports, fought off Portuguese gunboats, even stared down the British Navy. She controlled coastlines. Entire provinces bowed to her. But what made her more than a pirate was what came next. The Qing dynasty, furious, embarrassed, sent fleets after her. European empires tried to bribe her. Military commanders launched full campaigns, but she refused to be destroyed. And then, in a move almost no one expected, she surrendered. Not out of weakness, but out of brilliance. In 1810, she negotiated her own peace with the Chinese government. She walked into the halls of power with her head held high. She was granted amnesty, allowed to keep her wealth, allowed to retire. Unpunished, untouched. She walked away from one of the most powerful criminal empires the world had ever seen. Without a scratch. She opened a gambling house, raised a family, lived to old age, died peacefully at 69. No news. No bullet. No ocean grave. Just silence. But history, at least the quiet parts of it, remembers. Not as a footnote, but as a question. How did a woman with no title, no land, no name of power bend warlords and empires to her will? How did she rule a fleet like a kingdom, and a kingdom like a story she rewrote in real time? Zheng Yi Sao, the pirate queen of the South China Sea. Tonight, as your breath slows with the tide, as your thoughts drift like lanterns out to sea, imagine her, standing on the deck of a black-sailed junk, wind tangled in her hair. Stars above, the sea below. And not a single man daring to speak before she does. No crown. No throne. Just command. And silence. The kind only power knows. She was the storm. She was the law. She was the ocean. In human form. The night is almost and weightless the world now. Never saw her like coming. A breath held between centuries. We've drifted so far, across empires, over oceans, through palace doors and prison gates, all to find the women history tried to forget, but some could never be forgotten. Not because of the power they wielded. But because of the pain they carried. And tonight, we stand beside one of them. A woman born into faith and buried by fire. Her name was Joan of Arc. And she was not meant to survive. Yet somehow, her voice still echoes, not like thunder, but like a prayer. France, 1412. A country in fragments. Its king weak. Its land scarred by English invasion and civil war. The 100 Years' War had been grinding on for decades, leaving towns burned, families broken, hope barely clinging to the fields. In the village of Domremy, a child was born to peasant farmers. Her name was Jehan. She never learned to read or write. She grew up among sheep, mud, and superstition. And yet, at 13, she began to hear voices. They came to her softly. At first, only in moments of prayer. Then, louder. Clearer. She said it was Saint Michael. Saint Catherine. Saint Margaret. They told her something no one could have imagined, that she would save France. A girl. No nobility. No army. No power. Her. She resisted. Tried to ignore the voices, but they kept calling her. And so, at 16, she left her home. She walked miles to reach the court of the Dauphin Charles, the heir to a crumbling throne. He laughed at her. Called her mad. Tried to send her home. But then she spoke, and something in her voice changed everything. She convinced Charles to let her ride. They gave her armor, a banner, a sword, and in 1429, she rode at the head of the army to lift the siege of Orleans. A girl in white, astride a war horse. No weapon in her hands, only a standard of Christ, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. Her presence became fire, her faith, a weapon sharper than steel. She inspired soldiers, terrified enemies, changed the tide of battle by sheer force of belief. She claimed no glory, took no wealth. She fought only to see her king crowned. And when Charles VII finally was at Rheims Cathedral, just as she had prophesied, she wept. Not for herself, but for the future of France. But kings forget. Charles withdrew her support. She continued to fight, but without protection. And in 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians. Sold to the English and abandoned. She was imprisoned. Chained. Tried by church officials desperate to discredit her. Her charges: heresy. Witchcraft. Wearing men's clothing. But being a woman who led. She was interrogated for months. Alone. Terrified. Deprived of mass. Threatened with torture. She wavered, signed a confession, but then tore it up. She stood again, as herself, unbowed. On May 30th, 1431, at just 19 years old, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She asked for a crucifix, asked for forgiveness, and as the flames rose around her, she cried out the name of Christ again and again and again until the smoke took her voice. The executioner later said he feared he had burned a saint, and he had. 25 years later, the church declared her innocent. In 1920, she was canonized, Saint Joan. But even before the titles, the miracles, their redemption was something far rarer. She was a girl who believed herself, who stood in a world that said she couldn't, and did, not for glory. Not for revenge, but because she was called, and because she answered. So now, as the darkness presses closer, not cruelly, but gently, like the hush after prayer, imagine her, barefoot in a field, eyes closed, head tilted to the wind. Armor shining like a tear. Listening. Joan of Arc. Peasant. Prophet. Soldier. Martyr. Aflame. The world tried to. The hours are slow now, only scattered, like breath drawn across old stone. Maybe your thoughts are softening at the edges. Maybe your room feels farther away than it did before. This is how history lingers, not in noise, but in the hush between stories. We've walked with warriors and queens, women who carved their names into marble and memory. But not every legacy wears a crown. Some are stitched instead into cloth, into pages, into the pulse of a people. Tonight, we sit beside one such woman. Quiet, steady, unshaken. She did not rule a kingdom. She did not wield a sword. But she resisted and, in doing so, helped preserve a nation. Her name was Murasaki Shikibu, and she wrote the world's first novel, Japan. Around the year 1000. The Heian period, a time of silken refinement, of courtiers and poems and whispered glances behind paper screens. Kyoto was the center of power, where the aristocracy floated like lotus blossoms on a still pond. But beneath the layers of beauty and ritual, there was another kind of strength, the strength of the mind, sharpened in silence. And Murasaki was born into that silence. Her real name has been lost. Murasaki Shikibu is a nickname taken from one of her own characters. She was born to a lesser branch of the noble Fujiwara clan. Her father, a scholar, she learned Chinese, the language of the elite, though it was forbidden for women. Her father, astonished by her brilliance, once whispered, if only she were a boy. But she was not. She was a daughter, a widow, a court lady. And when she entered the court of Empress Shishi, quiet, watchful, dressed in 12 layers of silk, she brought something no one expected. She brought literature. Not poetry, though she mastered that too, but story. Long, complex, intimate, a tale of love, loss, and longing, of beauty and sorrow, of the delicate, devastating machinery of human hearts. She called it the tale of Ji-en-jai. It followed a prince elegant, flawed, doomed to desire as he moved through the seasons of life, through passion, guilt, grief. But it was not about him. Not really. It was about the women. The ones he loved, the ones he left, the ones who endured. Murasaki wove them from moonlight and shadow, women who were not perfect, but real. Their voices gentle, their pain unspoken but unmistakable. And in doing so, she made something new. Not just a novel, a mirror, a mirror that showed court life not as it pretended to be all ceremony and grace, but as it truly was. Lonely could hide. She wrote in secret, by lamplight, ink staining her sleeves, scrolls tucked between folded robes, and yet her story spread, passed from hand to hand, read aloud by women behind screens, by scholars in temples, by lovers. She changed the way a nation felt about itself, not by force, but by observation. No battle. No rebellion. Just the quiet revolution of being seen. She didn't live long. We don't know her face, only her words, but they are still here, more than 1,000 years later. And maybe that's the power that lasts the longest, not the fire of conquest, but the warmth of empathy, held steady over centuries. So now, as your thoughts drift like mist along the temple path, imagine her, kneeling on tatami, brush in hand, ink bowl reflecting candlelight. Outside, the snow falls soft, endless. Inside, she writes, not to be remembered. Just to understand. Muras eksh ikibu. Courtier. Poet. Novelist. A woman who looked into a world off. The night is heavy with stillness now. It stretches wide, like a quiet sea, and we drift across it, unmoored from time, following the faint lights of lives long extinguished, but never lost. Some stories blaze like fire, others burn low and constant, like coals beneath ash. Tonight, we come to one that glows with that quieter kind of heat, a legacy shaped not by battles or crowns, but by wisdom. By devotion. By the silent strength of belief. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen and visionary. Composer. Mystic. A woman who dared to speak when the world expected her to remain cloistered and still. The Holy Roman Empire. 1098. In a green valley of the Rhineland, where the wind brushed over forests like prayer, a sickly child was born. Her name was Hildegard, the 10th child of a noble family, and by custom, the 10th child was often given back to God. So at the age of 8, she was placed in the care of a religious reclusive woman named Jetta, who lived sealed in a stone cell beside a Benedictine monastery. Hildegard grew up behind those walls, not just with scripture and silence but with something more. Visions. From a young age, she saw light, not of the sun, but a luminous force behind the world, a brilliance she couldn't describe, yet couldn't ignore. She told no one. Afraid. Until she was 40 to die, and then she spoke, not in whispers, but in writing. She began to record what she saw: cosmic wheels turning in the heavens, angels dancing like flame, the voice of God rising through the bones of the earth. And in a time when women were forbidden to teach, when the church believed that revelation came only through ordained men, she published her visions. Civias, Know the Ways, a vast and vivid map of divine understanding, filled with blazing images of creation, justice, and salvation. Her words did not go unnoticed. The church did not silence her, they sanctioned her. Popes and emperors began to write to her, asking for advice, for guidance, for clarity. She wrote back, firmly, wisely, with a voice that spoke not only as a nun but as a prophet. She chastised bishops, advised kings, predicted political unrest, warned of corruption in the church. And still, she kept writing. But her gifts did not end with vision. She was also a scientist, a healer. An herbalist who cataloged the medicinal properties of over 200 plants. A composer who wrote some of the most haunting sacred music in history, hymns that shimmer like starlight, soaring and strange, as if some melodies were not like others. They rose to high, reached to far, and yet they endure. Listen closely, and you might still hear them, echoing through stone chapels, woven into the breath of monks, carried on candle smoke. She founded her own convent, taught other women, wrote plays, medical treatises, and letters that still crackle with the fire of intellect. And she did it all in an age when most women were not even taught to read. Her enemies called her arrogant, her followers called her divine, and she called herself a feather on the breath of God. She died in 1179. At the age of 8, a full life, in every sense, a rare life, not because she lived in isolation, but because she reached so far beyond it. Nearly 1,000 years later, the church finally canonized her, named her a doctor of the church, a title given to only a handful of saints, men and women alike, whose words hold lasting spiritual authority. But you don't need incense or Latin to feel her presence. Just listen, not with your ears, but with the part of you that wakes in the dark when the world is quiet, and the soul leans closer to the edge. Hildegard of Bingen and visionary. Healer. Voice in the wilderness. She didn't rise through war. She didn't rule by blood. She saw and shared what she saw. And in doing so, gave the world back a little of its light. So now, as your breath steady as sleep settles like snow, imagine her, a woman in a stone cell, head tilted to the sky, ink-stained fingers resting beside a candle, and a song strange and beautiful the night rising is almost softly from her lips. Its edges soften, its silence deepens. What was once shadow becomes outline, and what was once far feels close. 16 women. 16 lives. Each one a thread in the great, tattered cloth of history. And as we arrive at the last of them, the darkness doesn't close, it opens. Because sometimes, an ending is only another door. And this final woman, she walked through every door they told her to keep shut. She was no empress, no saint. No poet cloaked in incense and vision. She was free, because she freed herself. And in a world built to silence her, she did the unthinkable. She spoke. Her name was Sojourner Truth. She was born in bondage around 1797 in New York State, back when slavery still gripped even the northern soil. Her name then was Isabella Baumfree. She was on passed from one man to another like cattle, whipped, beaten, separated from her family, her body bought, her voice ignored, but something in her spirit did not break. At 29, she did what millions never could. She walked away. She took her infant daughter and escaped her enslaver's house. No maps, no money. Just faith. She found shelter with a Quaker family, who bought her freedom and gave her a place to rest. And it was there, with her hands still calloused from years of labor, that she was reborn. She took a new name, Sojourner, because she believed she would travel the land. Truth, because she had something to tell. She became a preacher, a speaker, a storm wrapped in linen. She stood in churches, in fields, in halls where no woman, no black woman had ever stood before. And when they told her to sit down, to be quiet, to know her place, she rose higher. In 1851, at a women's rights convention in Ohio, she stood in a room full of white suffragists who doubted her presence. And then slowly, powerfully, she asked, "Ain't I a woman?" She spoke of her back, scarred by the whip, her arms, strong enough to plow the fields, her children, sold and taken from her. And still, they questioned her womanhood. But she didn't beg them to see her. She dared them to. She wasn't polished. She wasn't careful. She was true. And in that truth, she moved hearts. She met with presidents, spoke alongside abolitionists, advocated not just for black freedom but for all women, not just for the vote but for dignity, safety, equality. She sold photographs of herself to support her mission, a gaze that stared into you, unflinching. Below each image, one phrase, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." She was the substance, the soul of a country trying to reckon with its own sins. She never learned to read or write, but she spoke like scripture. And when she died in 1883, she left behind more than a name. She left a standard. Of courage, of clarity, of a life lit from within, not by power, but by purpose. Tonight, as the last hush settles around your room, as the candle of this long journey flickers low, imagine her, a tall figure, wrapped in gray wool, feet bare from walking, not begging, voice rising, not pleading. Just standing. UNMOVABLE. Sojourner Truth, born in chains, died free, and left the world louder than she found it. And you, listener, dreamer, traveler of time, you've walked with her. With all of them, not just through history but through memory. And maybe, just maybe, you carry a piece of them now, a flicker of Theodora's defiance, Olga's fire, Joan's grace, Murasaki's stillness, Truth's strength. May they rest with you now, soft and steady, their names like lullabies. Before you drift off your shelter, take a deep breath. Let the echoes of these lives settle gently around you, not as noise, but as company. History isn't just about kings and conquests. It's about voices like these, quiet, powerful, impossible to forget. If this journey moved you even in some small, quiet way, consider leaving a comment. Tell me who stood out to you, or just let me know where you're listening from. I read every word. And if you'd like more soft, immersive stories like this of forgotten empires, strange centuries, quiet legends, please subscribe to Obscura Historia. There's always more waiting in the dark. And before the next tale begins, remember to dim the lights, keep a cool fan on nearby, and return whenever you need calm or company. Thank you for spending your night with me. Until next time, rest easy. And